She whispered 3 words. I was there in 10 minutes. Please don't let him hurt me. Those were the words my daughter whispered into the phone the night everything finally came apart. I can still hear what was behind her voice. Glass breaking. A man shouting. And fear, real fear. The kind no father ever forgets. By the time I reached her house 10 minutes later, my son-in-law Brandon was face down on his own kitchen floor with my knee pressed against his shoulder blade while 2 county deputies rushed through the front door. He kept yelling, "This old man attacked me." But the deputies weren't looking at him. They were looking at me. One of them noticed the way I controlled Brandon's wrist without injuring him. The positioning. The calm breathing. The situational awareness. Military men recognize certain things in each other. Even after decades. The older deputy studied me carefully and asked, "Sir, were you service?" I looked straight ahead. Retired Navy. That was all I said. I didn't mention the special operations teams. Didn't mention deployments. Didn't mention the men I buried along the way. At my age, you learn that silence is easier, especially when you spent most of your life trying to move past things you can't undo. 3 months earlier, nobody in our family would have believed things could end this way. Especially not Brandon. Brandon Holt was 39 years old. Tall, expensive haircut, loud opinions about everything. He sold luxury vehicles outside Wilmington and carried himself like a man who believed the world owed him applause simply for walking into a room. When he first married my daughter Sarah, I made a genuine effort to like him. Truth is, I wanted to like him. After my wife Helen died from breast cancer 11 years ago, Sarah was all I had left. So when she brought Brandon home smiling like a teenager again, I deliberately ignored things that bothered me. The bragging. The drinking. The way he interrupted her constantly. The way she laughed nervously whenever he made a cutting joke at her expense. I told myself every young couple had rough edges. Maybe that was my first mistake. My name is Raymond Holt, though no relation to Brandon, as life sometimes arranges those uncomfortable coincidences. I'm 68 years old. Retired widower. Living in a small coastal town in North Carolina where everybody fishes, everybody goes to church on Sunday morning, and everybody pretends family problems stay behind closed doors. Most people around here know me as the quiet older man with the pickup truck and the chocolate Labrador named Chester. They see me at the farmer's market buying produce. They see me repairing lawn equipment for neighbors who can't afford to replace it. They see me alone at the diner every Thursday morning with black coffee. That's all they see. And I preferred it that way. I spent 26 years inside naval special warfare. By the time I retired, I'd had enough noise, enough funerals, enough adrenaline for several lifetimes. Peace became precious. Or so I believed. The first time I noticed something truly wrong with Sarah's marriage was at Thanksgiving 2 years earlier. Sarah had always loved cooking alongside her mother when she was young. Sweet potato casserole, homemade rolls, pecan pie. Helen taught her everything. That Thanksgiving, Sarah accidentally overcooked the turkey slightly. Nothing dramatic, a little dry, nothing more. Brandon carved one slice, smirked, and said loudly at the table, "Good thing you're pretty, Sar, because you sure aren't winning any cooking awards." Everyone chuckled awkwardly. Sarah laughed too. But I noticed something. Her shoulders tightened the instant before the joke even finished, like a person bracing for impact they already expected. Years of training teach you to read tiny reactions. And tiny reactions tell the truth long before words do. I started watching more carefully after that. At Christmas, Brandon mocked the outfit Sarah chose. At Easter, he snapped at her for forgetting to bring ice. At family dinners, he corrected her stories constantly. That's not how it happened. You always exaggerate. Small humiliations. Delivered casually. Repeated endlessly. And every time Sarah smiled through it, that worried me more than if she'd fought back. One July evening, I invited them over for a backyard cookout. Nothing elaborate. Burgers, corn, a couple of neighbors. Brandon had been drinking before he arrived. I could smell it underneath his cologne. He watched me working beside the grill and laughed. "You know, Ray, you're the calmest old man I've ever met." I smiled politely. "Appreciate that." "Nah, I mean it." He tilted his beer bottle toward me. "Most retired military guys never stop talking about it. You barely mention yours at all." "That's because I'm retired." The neighbors chuckled softly. Brandon kept going. "I mean seriously, what did you even do in the Navy?" "File paperwork." More laughter. I shrugged. "Something like that." He spread his arms dramatically. "See, that's exactly what I mean. Sarah acts like you're some kind of secret legend. But I think military stories are mostly exaggerated anyway." The backyard went quiet. I simply flipped another burger. No anger. No reaction. That frustrated him more than anything I could have said. Men like Brandon feed on responses. Without one, they feel invisible. A few minutes later, Sarah came inside to help me carry plates. The moment we were alone, she whispered, "I'm sorry about him." I looked at her carefully. There was a faint bruise near her wrist, covered most of the way by her sleeve. My stomach tightened. What happened there? She instantly pulled the fabric down. "Nothing." "Sarah." She avoided my eyes. "Dad, please." That word. Please. Not defensive. Not irritated. Afraid. And in that moment, I knew. Maybe not every detail. But enough. That night, after everyone left, I sat alone in my garage workshop. Chester slept near my chair while rain tapped steadily against the roof. I opened an old wooden storage chest I hadn't touched in years. Inside were pieces of another life, photographs of men now gone, challenge coins, service decorations, a folded flag, and one laminated card. Emergency communication codes. When Sarah was 16, I taught her a simple safety system. Nothing extreme, just precautions. If she was ever in a dangerous situation and couldn't speak openly, she could send me specific short phrases through text. We treated it almost like a game back then. But I made her memorize one rule. If you ever send the actual distress signal, I come immediately. No questions asked. I remember Sarah rolling her eyes at 16. "Dad, you watch too many spy movies." Maybe I did. Or maybe fathers simply understand the world better than daughters wish they did. Around midnight, my phone buzzed beside my chair. A text from Sarah, "Dad, can you send me Mom's peach cobbler recipe?" Below it, a short string of numbers. My blood went cold in an instant. Those numbers meant one thing. Immediate danger. Contact police. I stared at the screen for maybe 2 seconds. Then 26 years of training woke back up inside my bones. Calm. Focused. Cold. I stood slowly, walked to the safe, and opened it. Not out of desire for violence, because my daughter was afraid. And fear transforms a father into something entirely different. There's something strange about fear when you get older. Young men believe fear feels loud. Heart hammering, hands shaking, breathing in short bursts. But real fear, the kind that arrives when someone you love may be in danger, comes quietly, cold, focused, efficient. That's how I felt driving through the dark towards Sarah's neighborhood. Windshield wipers pushed heavy rain aside. My old Ford rattled over potholes I barely noticed. I had 911 dispatch on speaker. The young woman answering sounded careful. "Sir, can you describe the situation?" "Possible domestic assault in progress," I said evenly. "Female victim inside. Male suspect intoxicated. Are you currently approaching the house?" "Yes. Please wait for responding officers." I looked at the red taillights ahead of me dissolving into rain. "No," I answered quietly. "I won't be doing that." A brief pause. Then, "Sir, are you armed?" "Yes." "What kind of firearm?" secured in the vehicle. I don't intend to use it unless absolutely necessary. That part was completely true. People misunderstand men like me. They imagine retired military veterans are eager for confrontation. Most of us spend the rest of our lives trying to avoid it. Officers are 4 minutes out, the dispatcher said. I'll manage until they arrive. I ended the call before she could argue further. Sarah's neighborhood sat near the edge of town beside an unfinished development. Dark houses, wet pavement, no movement. The rain had eased to a light drizzle by the time I parked across the street. Every downstairs light in their home was burning. I could hear yelling before I stepped out of the truck. Brandon. Drunk. Raging. I crossed the front yard without rushing. Age changes how you move. At 68, my knees ache in cold weather and my shoulders remind me of every hard landing from my younger years. But training never fully leaves the body. Not the parts that matter. Awareness. Balance. Timing. Through the front window, I saw Sarah. And every fear I had carried quietly for 2 years became real all at once. She was backed against the kitchen counter, crying. Her lip was bleeding. Brandon stood inches from her face, screaming, while broken glass covered the floor around them. He grabbed her wrist hard enough to make her stumble backward. Something inside me became perfectly still. Not angry. That surprises people when I tell this story. I wasn't angry. Not yet. Anger is emotional. This was something different. Protective. Like watching a predator move toward someone who cannot defend themselves. I moved toward the side gate leading to the back. The patio door wasn't fully latched. Rain-softened curtains moved gently in the opening. Inside, Brandon kept shouting. You think your daddy's going to save you? Sarah tried pulling away. Please stop. Then he shoved her shoulder. Not enough to knock her down. Exactly enough to terrify her. That was enough for me. I entered without a sound. No announcement. No threats. The old hardwood floor barely registered under my boots. Brandon didn't notice me until Sarah looked past him suddenly. Her eyes went wide. Dad. He turned around laughing, and for one extraordinary moment, he actually smiled at me. Look who showed up, he slurred. The legend himself. I kept walking calmly toward him. Step away from her. He scoffed. Or what? Step away from my daughter. Sarah's breathing was shallow and panicked behind him. Brandon spread his arms wide. Oh, the old man's serious. Then he pointed at me. You know what your problem is, Ray? Everybody treats you like some wise old veteran, but you're just another retired nobody hiding in a garage. I didn't answer. People expect violence to announce itself loudly. Real danger rarely does. Brandon took 2 aggressive steps toward me. Bad decision. The moment his right shoulder dipped forward, instinct took over. One movement, fast enough that he never understood what happened. I redirected his arm, rotated behind him, and drove him face first onto the kitchen floor before he could throw a punch. His breath exploded out in a curse. What the? I pinned his wrist carefully but firmly. Enough to control him completely. Not enough to cause injury. Stop resisting, I said calmly. Brandon thrashed beneath me in disbelief. How did you? Stop. He tried, pushing upward. I adjusted the pressure slightly. He gasped immediately. Pain compliance. Precise. Controlled. Temporary. Old skills. You're hurting me, he yelled. You're not hurt, I answered. You're restrained. That made him even angrier. He continued shouting while police lights swept across the living room windows. 2 deputies came through the front door with weapons drawn. Sheriff's Department. I immediately released one hand and raised it slightly. Victim is secure. Suspect is restrained. Both deputies paused for just a moment. The younger officer focused on Brandon. The older deputy looked at me with the particular focus of someone recognizing something specific. Not my face. My behavior. Calm breathing. Awareness. Controlled restraint. Military. Sir, can you stand up slowly for me? I nodded once and rose carefully. The moment pressure lifted, Brandon rolled over and began shouting dramatically. That man attacked me. I'm the victim here. The deputy ignored him completely. He looked toward Sarah instead. Ma'am, are you injured? Sarah's lip trembled. Yes. That single word changed the entire atmosphere of the room. The younger officer handcuffed Brandon while reading him his rights over his furious objections. This is insane. You can't. Nobody was listening. Sarah suddenly collapsed against the kitchen counter in tears. Real tears. The kind that have been building for years behind a smile that was always slightly too forced. I took the blanket hanging over the nearby chair and wrapped it gently around her shoulders, the same way I used to after thunderstorms when she was small. It's all right, I said quietly. You're safe now. She held onto me tightly, and that nearly undid me completely. Because fathers always believe they'll recognize when their child is suffering. But sometimes suffering grows slowly and quietly, inside your own family, until a phone buzzes at midnight and the truth arrives all at once. The older deputy stepped beside me after the paramedics arrived. His voice was low and respectful. You military? I nodded. Retired Navy. His eyes moved briefly to the way I'd controlled Brandon. Then back to me. You handled yourself professionally tonight. I almost smiled at that word. Professionally. As though this were just another mission. It wasn't. This was my daughter. And standing there in that broken kitchen, I realized something that shamed me. I should have come sooner. The strangest thing about a house after violence is the silence. Not the peaceful kind. The heavy kind. The sort that settles into the walls like smoke after a fire. Sarah stayed with me after Brandon's arrest. She slept in her old bedroom upstairs, the same room with the faded horse posters she'd put up at 13. I hadn't changed much in there since she left. Same quilt Helen sewed years ago. Same ceramic lamp shaped like a lighthouse. Part of me had always hoped she'd come home someday. Just not this way. The first morning, I was up before sunrise out of old habit, making coffee in the kitchen while Chester slept near the back door. Sarah came downstairs wearing one of my old navy sweatshirts. Her lip looked worse in the daylight. Purple swelling, a small cut at the corner. She avoided my eyes while pouring coffee. Sorry, she whispered. For what? For all of this. That answer told me everything I needed to know about how long she had been emotionally trapped. Victims apologize for surviving. I pulled out a chair and sat across from her. You don't owe me an apology, sweetheart. Tears filled her eyes immediately. She looked away fast. I should have left him earlier. Maybe, I said carefully. But fear keeps people in bad places longer than they should stay. That's not weakness. That's fear. After a long silence, she whispered something that cut straight through me. I didn't want you to think I'd failed. At 68 years old, after everything life puts a man through, certain sentences still know exactly where to land. I stared at my coffee quietly. Because some of that was my fault. I wasn't an easy father after Helen died. My generation was raised to treat grief like weakness. Men work through pain by staying busy, staying quiet, keeping moving. So after cancer took my wife, that's what I did. Fixed engines. Cleaned gutters. Mowed the lawn twice a week. Anything to avoid sitting still long enough to feel the loneliness. Sarah was 24 then, still needing her father. And I quietly disappeared into myself instead. Not cruelly, just completely. Children notice emotional distance more than we realize. A few days later, Sarah finally started talking openly. We sat on the back porch watching rain drift across the marsh behind my property while Chester chased movement through the wet grass. He wasn't always like this, she said softly. I stayed quiet. first, Brandon was charming, attentive, made me feel protected. That's usually how it starts, I said. She nodded slowly. After we got married, small things changed. He started criticizing my friends, then my clothes, then how I spoke. If dinner wasn't ready on time, he'd get cold and distant. If I disagreed with him in public, he'd find a way to punish me for it afterward. What kind of punishment? She swallowed. Silent treatment at first. Her voice became smaller, then yelling. I already knew what came next before she said it. The first time he shoved me, he cried afterward. Said he was overwhelmed with work pressure. Said it would never happen again. I closed my eyes briefly. The classic cycle. Apology. Temporary gentleness. Then escalation. I kept thinking, Sarah whispered, that if I just became calmer, or more patient, or better somehow, things would go back to normal. That's not how men like Brandon function. I know that now. She looked at me carefully. I didn't then. The pain in her voice wasn't only fear. It was shame. That's something people misunderstand about abuse. Shame traps victims almost as effectively as fear does, especially people from good families who were raised to protect appearances, to keep private things private. Sarah whispered, I was embarrassed that people would think I'd chosen the wrong person. I leaned back in my chair. Everybody chooses wrongly sometimes. She shook her head. Not Mom. That one hurt. Because Helen had been warm where I was measured, gentle where I was disciplined. Sarah had inherited her mother's softness. And that softness had made her vulnerable to a man who mistook kindness for weakness. A few days later, Detective Claire Sutton visited the house. Mid-40s, straightforward, no performance about her. She sat at my kitchen table reviewing paperwork while Sarah twisted a paper napkin in her hands. We've gone through Mr. Holt's phone and devices, the detective said. There's substantial evidence supporting ongoing domestic abuse. Sarah looked down at the table. Then quietly she said, There's more. The detective raised an eyebrow. Sarah reached into her bag and produced a small flash drive. I started recording arguments several months ago. The room went still. Detective Sutton plugged the drive into her laptop and put on headphones. The first recording lasted 40 seconds. 40 seconds was enough. Brandon screaming. Objects breaking. Sarah crying. Then one sentence from Brandon that made my blood go cold. If your father ever gets involved, I'll make sure he regrets it. The detective removed the headphones slowly. That, she said quietly, is going to matter significantly for your case. Sarah looked ashamed again. I know recording him felt wrong. Detective Sutton shook her head immediately. No. Surviving isn't wrong. That sentence visibly shifted something in Sarah. Sometimes victims need explicit permission to stop blaming themselves. That evening, after the detective left, I went into the garage alone. I sat at the old workbench staring at the wall for a long time. Combat memories came back more readily after the arrest. Funny how trauma operates. You spend decades locking certain doors in your mind. Then one emotional jolt opens all of them simultaneously. I remembered young men I served beside overseas. Remembered the calls I helped deliver to families. Remembered all the times I stayed emotionally contained because that's what the job required. Maybe I'd carried that same containment home. Compartmentalized too much. For too long. In the wrong places. Later that night, Sarah found me sitting in the dark. She stepped beside my chair quietly. Can't sleep either? I shook my head. For a moment, we just listened to rain on the garage roof. Then she asked something nobody had put to me in years. Dad, were you afraid over there? I gave a small tired smile. All the time. She looked genuinely surprised. But fear doesn't disappear because of training, I said. What matters is what you choose to do while afraid. Sarah looked down thoughtfully. Then she whispered, "I was afraid every single day with Brandon." I reached over and took her hand. "You don't have to live afraid anymore." And for the first time since she was a little girl, my daughter leaned against my shoulder and cried herself to sleep. I never expected to wear my dress uniform again. The last time had been at Helen's funeral 11 years earlier. I'd worn only the jacket then, because she loved seeing me in uniform. Said it reminded her that underneath all my quietness, there was still a man who had once carried himself with pride. After she died, I packed it away and assumed it would stay there. But life has a way of reopening old closets when family is involved. Brandon's preliminary hearing fell on a gray October morning, cold rain, the kind of Carolina damp that settles into joints. Sarah sat beside me outside the courtroom clutching a paper cup of coffee. She looked healthier than she had in years, but still fragile in certain moments. Healing isn't dramatic. It arrives slowly, in waves, one morning at a time. Inside the courtroom, Brandon looked smaller than I remembered. Not physically. Spiritually. Confidence disappears once consequences arrive. His expensive suits were gone. His hair was unwashed. Dark circles framed his eyes from weeks in county lockup. But the bitterness was still there. The moment he saw me beside Sarah, his jaw tightened. His parents sat behind him looking exhausted and mortified. I felt genuine sympathy for them. No parent raises a child hoping he'll become cruel. Brandon's attorney immediately framed him as the victim, common strategy in domestic violence cases involving money. He described Brandon as a stressed husband, a successful provider, a man struggling emotionally. Then he turned toward me. "Mr. Raymond Hayes," the lawyer began dramatically, "used excessive force while acting entirely outside the law." I remained perfectly still. The prosecutor looked unmoved, because evidence doesn't care about performance. The state presented Sarah's injuries, police photographs, audio recordings, medical reports, neighbor statements. Then came the body camera footage from the responding deputies. The courtroom watched silently. There I was on screen, calm, controlled, restraining Brandon without striking him. No rage, no screaming. Simple containment. One deputy's camera caught Brandon shouting drunken threats while Sarah stood against the counter, bleeding and crying. The defense argument weakened substantially after that. But Brandon wasn't finished. When he took the stand, he blamed everything and everyone except himself. The alcohol, work stress, Sarah being too emotional. Then he looked directly toward us and sneered. "She turned against me because of him. He manipulated her." That sentence did something unexpected to Sarah. I felt it happen beside me. Something in her hardened. She stood before the prosecutor, even asked. "No," she said quietly. The courtroom turned toward her. "My father didn't manipulate me." She took a steadying breath. "He saved my life." Complete silence followed. Sarah then described years of emotional abuse in careful, painful detail. The insults, the isolation, the constant fear. Walking on eggshells inside her own home every single day. Several jurors looked visibly moved. One older woman quietly pressed a hand to her eyes. Then Sarah said something that hit me harder than any memory from overseas ever had. I stopped recognizing myself during that marriage. War wounds soldiers. Abuse erases people slowly while they're still living. During a recess, the prosecutor found me near the hallway. "You were special warfare, weren't you?" I nodded once. She smiled faintly. "My brother was recon. I can always tell. Military people recognize each other without needing credentials." She hesitated before her next sentence. "Your restraint that night probably protected your daughter's entire case." "How so?" "If you'd lost control and harmed him badly, the defense would have shifted the entire focus onto you." She looked at me steadily. "Control protects people longer than revenge ever does." I had spent decades learning that. Some lessons only arrive after significant cost. The final sentencing hearing came 6 weeks later. That morning, I climbed into the attic and found the old garment bag. The fabric of the uniform smelled faintly of cedar and thyme. As I pinned the medals back into position one by one, memories returned that I hadn't visited in years. Friends laughing on transport flights. Young men writing letters home. Funerals with folded flags. I stared at my decoration for a long moment before attaching it carefully. Truthfully, I never valued medals much. They can't restore anything lost. But they matter to civilians. They remind people that sacrifice existed before comfort became the default. When I walked into the courthouse in full dress whites, conversations stopped. Even Sarah stared. "You never wear that," she said quietly. "I know. You look different." Maybe I did. Or maybe she was finally seeing all the parts of me I had spent years keeping carefully out of sight. Inside the courtroom, Brandon looked stunned the moment he saw me enter. For the first time since I'd known him, something that looked like genuine fear crossed his face. She sat beside me at the kitchen table while I opened it carefully. Because he suddenly understood something humiliating. Uneven, the quiet older man no excuses, at cookouts no had spent a lifetime just carrying honesty that Brandon couldn't survive for a single Brandon admitted the judge reviewed the full record carefully before sentencing. His drinking. Then she asked if I wished to make a statement. His shame. I stood one slowly. Line stood out every most. Joint reminded me of my age, trying to feel powerful my voice by making the people steady. Around me smaller. I've spent most of that my life around violence. Me rehabilitation might actually be doing was still, or at least beginning to. Fear. Sarah watched me, and one thing I learned over those decades is this. I folded the letter toward Brandon. Remorse has nothing to do with making people afraid of you. Do you forgive him? Several people looked sat heavily between us. Real strength is protecting at my age who cannot come to understand that forgiveness isn't a switch you flip. Carefully. It's a decision you practice repeatedly. Brandon sometimes stared at the table now. Failing. The arrogance was entirely gone. I don't know yet. Then I said something even Sarah I hadn't nodded slowly. Saying, "That's I don't fair. Hate Brandon." Then, after a long Sarah quiet, looked at me she quickly. Whispered something that very nearly brought tears to my eyes. I hate what he chose to do for saving me. But hatred causes I looked permanent at my daughter when you carefully. Feed it long enough. Healthier now. I'm asking this court for accountability. Still healing in the slow. I looked at the judge directly. Healing happens. Not destruction. And I realized something the sentence important. Included prison time. I hadn't mandatory rehabilitation. She domestic saved violence the moment she and asked permanent for help. Restraining orders. Many people as the deputies led Brandon that toward the exit. Its own kind he of suddenly courage. Stopped a and kind that doesn't get Sarah. Nearly enough tears recognition. Filled his eyes. A few Sundays later, not the family gathered for dinner at my something house. That looked like the nothing genuine article. Elaborate, broken, fried late chicken, and far too small for what it owes. I'm cornbread. He whispered. The kind of meal Helen Sarah used to make when money was tight. She simply held my hand. Sunlight came through the kitchen window through the while Caleb laughed at something and for the first time in years, Sarah the fear that had lived behind her eyes was finally gone. Winter passed slowly not after the trial mode. That's the thing about smiling. Nothing moves quickly anymore. Sitting there at that old wooden table, not trust, listening to dishes clatter and voices fill the house again. Everything understood something that took me nearly 7 decades to learn. By February, when I was young, Carolina rain had softened into quieter mornings. The trees behind my property showed me early green meant surviving. And Sarah slowly began putting pieces of her life back together. Taught me she found a small apartment above a florist shop downtown when someone you love is a widow named Louise. Strength is staying control when anger would feel so much of morning light. Strength that is protecting people without losing your humanity after chaos. And she returned to work part-time at the public library. Strength is allowing yourself to heal whispers too. And sideways. If this story reached something in you tonight, small if you've ever loved someone through pain, most people treated her gently, or learned hard lessons later than you wished you had. The ones who had lived long enough someone to recognize pain without needing it explained. No matter your age, one afternoon it is never too late to choose kindness over control, something quietly, peace over pride, I thought and love everyone would judge me for staying. I stirred cream into my mug. Most people past 60 have survived something difficult. That changes how they see others. She looked down. I still feel ashamed sometimes. That feeling may linger a while, I said honestly. She looked worried, so I added, but shame fades faster when it meets love instead of secrecy. Helen used to say things like that. Funny how marriage leaves pieces of people living inside you long after they're gone. As for me, things changed too. 4 years after retiring, I had isolated myself more than I ever admitted. Routine became a hiding place. Hardware store, fishing pier, television, sleep, repeat. But after everything with Sarah, silence no longer felt peaceful. It felt like what it actually was. Loneliness. So I started reconnecting, mostly with old veterans. A retired Marine named Gerald convinced me to start coming to Wednesday breakfast at the VFW hall. I resisted at first. Too many memories, too many stories sitting just beneath the surface. But eventually I went. Turns out old soldiers laugh more than civilians expect. We talked about grandchildren, bad knees, blood pressure, boats that refused to start. Very little about combat. That surprised people sometimes. The truth is, veterans don't spend their later years reliving war. Mostly we spend them appreciating ordinary peace. One morning after breakfast, Gerald looked at me over his coffee and said, "You seem lighter lately." I thought about that the whole drive home. Maybe he was right. Not happy exactly, but lighter. Like something old and heavy had finally shifted. Around spring, Sarah brought my grandson, Caleb, over for Sunday dinner. Caleb was 10 years old. Skinny, curious, missing one front tooth, and absolutely certain about most things the way only 10-year-olds can be. Before the divorce proceedings, Brandon had rarely allowed him to visit me alone. Said I was too old-fashioned. Now Caleb ran through my backyard like he owned the place. Children recover from tension faster than adults, if you give them safety early enough. That afternoon, we sat beside the small lake near my property, fishing for bluegill while dragonflies skimmed the surface. Caleb studied me with the direct seriousness only children maintain. "Mom says you were in the Navy." I was. "Like regular Navy?" I smiled. "Something like that." He grinned. "Mom says you tackled Brandon like a superhero." I nearly choked. "Your mother exaggerates." "No, she doesn't." "Yes, she does." "Nope." I shook my head, still smiling. Then Caleb went quiet for a moment. When he looked up, his voice was small and serious. "Why was my dad so mean?" There it was. The question every child eventually asks. I looked out over the lake before answering carefully. Sometimes people carry anger they never learned how to manage. "Did he hate Mom?" "No," I said honestly. "That's what makes it sad." Caleb frowned. "Then why did he hurt her?" I thought about years of studying violence in its many forms: war, control, fear, abuse. Then I answered the simplest way I could. Because some people confuse love with ownership. Caleb considered that with the seriousness of someone genuinely processing it. Then he nodded slowly, the way children do when they understand more than we give them credit for. A few minutes later, I handed him the fishing rod. "You know what real strength is." He looked up. "Making people feel safe when they're around you." He smiled proudly after catching a small bluegill 15 minutes later. At 10 years old, he already handled disappointment better than many grown men I'd known. One evening in early summer, Sarah arrived carrying an envelope. No return address. Prison postmark. Brandon. She sat beside me at the kitchen table while I opened it carefully. The letter was handwritten. Uneven. No excuses, no performance. Just honesty that looked painful to have written. Brandon admitted things I never expected from him. His drinking. His need for control. His shame. One line stood out most. "I spent years trying to feel powerful by making the people around me smaller." That sentence told me rehabilitation might actually be doing something. Or at least beginning to. Sarah watched me finish reading. "What do you think?" I folded the letter carefully. Remorse is painful when it's genuine. "Do you forgive him?" That question sat heavily between us for a moment. At my age, I've come to understand that forgiveness isn't a switch you flip. It's a decision you practice repeatedly, sometimes daily, sometimes failing, sometimes not. I don't know yet, I admitted. Sarah nodded slowly. That's fair. Then, after a long quiet, she whispered something that very nearly brought tears to my eyes. Thank you for saving me. I looked at my daughter carefully. Healthier now, stronger, still healing in the slow, honest way real healing happens. And I realized something important. I hadn't saved her alone. She saved herself the moment she asked for help. Many people never do. That takes its own kind of courage, a kind that doesn't get nearly enough recognition. A few Sundays later, the family gathered for dinner at my house. Nothing elaborate. Fried chicken, mashed potatoes, cornbread. The kind of meal Helen used to make when money was tight, but love wasn't. Sunlight came through the kitchen windows while Caleb laughed at something on television. Sarah looked peaceful in a way I hadn't seen in years. Real peace. Not survival mode. Not forced smiling. Just peace. Sitting there at that old wooden table, listening to dishes clatter and voices fill the house again, I finally understood something that took me nearly 7 decades to learn. When I was young, I believed strength meant winning confrontations. Then military service taught me strength meant surviving tremendous pain. But growing older taught me the truth. Strength is answering the phone when someone you love is afraid. Strength is staying controlled when anger would feel so much easier. Strength is protecting people without losing your humanity in the process. And sometimes, quietly, privately, strength is allowing yourself to heal, too. If this story reached something in you tonight, if you've ever loved someone through pain, protected your family, or learned hard lessons later than you wished you had, please share it with someone who may need to hear it. And remember, no matter your age, it is never too late to choose kindness over control, peace over pride, and love over fear.